I bought this screen 2 months ago now, and there were just so many questions on the last video about this screen. I thought now would be a good chance to fill you in on what my experience has been like using this screen almost daily for the last couple of months. And I'll also be answering all of the questions that you guys posted on the back of the last video, so stick around to find the answers that you have been looking for. Now, one of the main issues, if you call it that, with my last review is that I was using old technology. My PC was running a 2080 graphics card, which is like, what, 5 years old now, which struggled to run games, let alone get anywhere near pushing this screen to its maximum. And the M1 Mac Studio I was using wasn't the latest M2 version, which has support for HDMI 2.1. But all of that has now changed after spending far too much of my own money to rectify these problems and help you get the answers for the questions that you've all asked. So I now have an M2 Mac Studio, and the PC is now a top spec 14th gen i9 with a 7900 XTX card in it. Now, I did make a mistake in my last video when I said that I needed to buy 4090 graphics card to be able to get the full performance from this screen. Now, my knowledge wasn't really up to scratch on like specs and all PC kind of things just then, but now I've built this gaming PC myself, I now understand. And basically the 7900 XTX is the only card which is currently capable of driving a screen of this kind of size and type, like full native resolution at full 240 Hertz. So now that is done, let me catch you up with where we are here. So let's go with PC first, and then we'll move on to the Mac with the brand new build and over DisplayPort this time. But first of all, be sure to enable DisplayPort 2.1 from the menu on the screen, because it comes default with like 1.4 as default. But once you've done that, on the Windows desktop, you can get the full 7680 by 2160 at 240 Hertz and in 10-bit color and in HDR, like all the stuff enabled. Now, I don't have a 4080 or 4090 graphics card, but I do know someone who does have that and also owns this monitor, and they are getting 5120 by 1440 at 240 Hertz over DisplayPort. But to get the full, again, 7680 by 2160, they have to drop to 120 Hertz over both DisplayPort and HDMI. So the same results over both of the ports there. Now, on the Mac side of things, on the M1 Mac Studio, like I mentioned in my previous video, the best I could get was using two inputs, one DisplayPort and one HDMI, and then I could kind of connect them both in and get the full resolution, but with one half of the screen at 120 Hertz and the other at 60 Hertz by using picture-by-picture mode. But now, with the M2 Mac Studio, which has the M2 Max chip in it, which now has HDMI 2.1, I can get 120 Hertz at full native resolution. Unfortunately, not 240 Hertz, but honestly, I'm not really doing that much gaming on the Mac anyway, and 120 Hertz is just fine for daily desktop stuff like browsing and emailing and all those kind of things. But let's talk gaming now, because this is one that I've seen a lot of questions about. And also, I had a lot of questions myself of what sort of performance I could expect from this screen and from a PC I've just spent like $4,000 on at the moment. So hopefully it's been worth it. Now, in Fortnite at full resolution, I got around 70 FPS with all the settings maxed out. Now, if I drop the resolution down to 5120 by 1440, then I get around 80 to 90 FPS. Now, I can hit 200 FPS if I set Fortnite to low quality, but to get over 250 FPS, you have to drop the resolution down to 3840 by 1080. Now, over to Warzone, I hit around 120 FPS with ultra quality settings, which I thought was pretty good. Then when set to balanced, it was more like 160 to 170 FPS. But no matter what settings I've tried, I just can't get over this frame rate. Like, even dropping the quality, even dropping the resolution as low as possible, it still won't go above that frame rate. Overwatch 2 now, 100 FPS in ultra settings, but then again, drop the resolution down to 3840 by 1080, and medium settings went over 250 FPS. So that kind of seems to be the sweet spot if you want to max the FPS, kind of drop it down to that resolution, but you are sacrificing quite a bit of quality to then reach that in some games. Minecraft, speaking of which, hits way over 250 FPS, so at least that's something. Now, Forza, the latest Forza game that's just come out, hits around 75 FPS on ultra settings, up to 110 FPS if you drop the resolution down a notch, and 150 FPS if you drop down to the high settings. So as far as I'm concerned here, you can get some pretty good results with the 7900 XTX. Now, depending on the games you're playing, it may be worth going for a 4080 or 4090 card that, whilst only does 120 Hz refresh rates, may be able to push more FPS in games like maybe Fortnite or Forza at their highest quality settings. Now, I am still super happy with my 7900 XTX for now. Maybe the 5090 might come out and that might tempt me, potentially. Now, like I said, I had a lot of questions. That's like an understatement about this screen. I've also spent a ton of money upgrading my gear to be able to answer many of these questions. So if anything, I'd really appreciate if you subscribe to the channel if you like this content. And after I've covered the questions off, I'm going to tell you about the issues I've had with the screen so far, just to kind of so you're aware of those as well. So cracking through the questions first in no particular order. First up, is it easy to switch between inputs? Yes, it is. You just hit right on the D-pad under the screen, I think it is, and then you can just switch inputs from there. And yes, you can have both Mac and PC on the screen together by using picture-by-picture mode, so you can keep an eye on your video export whilst playing a game at the same time. Now, the next one is a question that was asked many, many times by various different people. In picture-by-picture mode, with one device on one side and one on the other, do you still get HDR and VRR? Unfortunately, when you do go into picture-by-picture mode, one side is locked, it seems, to 120 hertz, and the other is locked at 60. Or, I mean, you can go 60 both sides if you want to, and neither of them get options for HDR or VRR. Now, hooking up an Xbox, similar results. It will do UHD at 60 hertz, but nothing above that. But I did see some strange things going on here, like when I had my PC connected, it was always the one that got 120 hertz, which was connected via DisplayPort, whilst all the other devices, Xbox, PlayStation, were connected via HDMI. So perhaps there's a limitation around showing devices using both HDMI 2.1 and DisplayPort 2.1 at the same time. Next up, can you stack two of these monitors? I haven't yet come across a mount that's capable of supporting the weight of even just one monitor yet, but if you do, drop a link down below in the comments, particularly if you can do two on top of each other, that would be just... oh, that would be insane. Next question, what is the desk shelf I'm using under the monitor? Funny question, but it is a Grove-made desk. I'll leave a link down below, which has all these little cubby holes and shelves and things. Really, really useful. Next up, can you run games in 21:9, 5120x2160 resolution? So you have a few different options here. You can set the screen itself on the menu to a custom aspect ratio. There are also a few preset defaults which you can choose from. And then, depending of course on the graphics card you're using, you can create custom resolutions to allow you to play in whichever settings you want. Now, it can get quite complicated and confusing sometimes to create all of those modes, but it is technically possible. Next up, where is the link for the monitor arm? Down in the description again. Next one is, can you split the screen into three? So that's using one screen and then kind of virtually splitting the space into three. And yes, you can use a tool like Fancy Zones, which is by Microsoft, to split the screen into three different zones. And it also lets you easily snap the windows to fill like the center area whilst having the two kind of edge areas as well. Does it have horizontal lines at 240 hertz? No, this screen does not have the horizontal lines at 240 hertz. Now, this was actually an issue that plagued some of the very early generation Samsung G9 screens. For me, I only ever saw that on it was definitely the first generation, possibly the second generation, but not ever since then. And since then, like the G9 Neo, G9 OLED, it's been fine ever since. What kind of compatibility is there with a MacBook Pro M2 Max? Now, my Mac Studio is an M2 Max version with HDMI 2.1, and you can get the full native resolution, but only 120 hertz. Again, personally for me, that's good enough for what I'm doing. Unfortunately, you just can't get the full 240 hertz. Maybe next year. Or this year, whenever they're going to release new products. What is the backlight bleed like when using dark themes? Okay, so here is the 57-inch G9 Neo with just a black image showing so you can see the backlight bleed. And here is the 49-inch G9 OLED. Now, personally, I've not noticed any issues with backlight bleed. The only times I've really had a problem, I guess, if you can call it that, is when everything is totally black and then there's one like bright white object and you can easily see like the haloing that comes from like the dimming zones. It is kind of annoying. No, it doesn't really ruin the experience of using this screen for me. And yes, I would love a 57-inch OLED version of this screen. Next question is G9 or eARC for gaming? Now, this is a tough question. I would say it depends on how close you are sat to the screen. Now, if you're more than a meter away from the screen, then I would say the eARC isn't a bad choice, but if it's at a traditional desk, I'd personally go for the G9, kind of like I am here, as it's just more, I don't hate using the word like immersive, but it's more immersive because it wraps around you. Whereas with the eARC, you have to look up an awful lot because, when you're sat quite close, it's quite a lot of space to look around. And also because the eARC has a really stupid, in my opinion, like huge one connect box that is nearly impossible. I mean, it's gigantic. It's impossible to find any space for it to fit on your desk. It's kind of like more like a TV box that you would get. Now, the 57-inch G9 is more comfortable. I find you can just focus on the center when you're playing games. And then if you want that wider field of view, then you can look around again if you want to. And this is kind of one of the many advantages you get by having a screen with that wider field of view versus something like the eARC or just a regular aspect ratio where you'd have to, physically move your view around to be able to see things. Next question is, can you run a game in the center whilst also using the side? So this is for like Twitch streaming or Discord or whatever might be going on and keeping an eye on your comments whilst you're streaming, or maybe just want some other apps open. Now, yes, you can technically do this by using that Fancy Zones app, that kind of window management app I mentioned earlier, but it can be hit and miss. It just kind of depends on the game you play. The reason is there's no real way of making a game like full screen, but only consume the center part of the screen full screen. So you have to kind of put the game into windowed mode. So it just depends whether the game supports the Windows mode and just how well you get on with playing in window mode, because you obviously get the bar at the top and those kind of things. So yeah, not the best, but technically is possible. Question is, can you switch inputs and picture modes with DDC/CI commands over DisplayPort? I actually had to look this up. Genuinely didn't know this was a thing. Now, unfortunately not. I actually downloaded an app called Monitorian, which shows that it's not able to communicate with the G9 screen. I did check also through the menu settings on screen for an option to enable or disable this, but there's just no options there either. So I'm guessing that's basically a flat out no. And this is basically so you can control from your PC, you could change the brightness, the contrast, the color. You can full on switch inputs if you really wanted to, but unfortunately not available on this screen here. Next up, does this monitor support DisplayPort 1.4? Yes, it does actually ship with it set to 1.4 by default, but you have to manually flip the switch to 2.1 in the menu system. Now again, I don't have a 4090 here, but I read up a ton about this when figuring out which card to use. And even though you do, I believe, have HDMI 2.1 on the card itself, there's a limitation that means it can't drive the full native resolution at 240 Hz. But as I mentioned earlier, you can reduce the resolution down a notch to get the full 240 Hz at 1440p instead. Next up, this was an interesting one. Is it too curved to do video editing? And then a second but similarly related question, how on earth can you draw a straight line when everything is curved? Now, I love this monitor for video editing. It is really hard to see unless you can see it in person, but when you're sat in front of the screen and as you rotate your head, it's basically a flat surface you're looking at because there's no perceived curve to the image that you're looking at. Like, no matter where you turn your head, the screen is always the same distance away from your face because of that curve. So no issues drawing a straight line because it's literally the same as that. It's actually more off-putting having a flat screen technically because you're looking at that, and as the screen gets further away from you, it's getting further away from you. So it's, yeah. I mean, potato, it's easy to draw a straight line on the curved monitor. Question, can you show a video on how to install the monitor on that arm? I have a Vivo arm which supports 49-inch ultra-wides. Okay, so the arm I'm using is the Ergotron Monitor Arm, which has the heavy-duty pivot, which you can either buy separately or you can buy bundled with the monitor arm itself. The problem though is that even though this monitor arm on paper should support the 57-inch G9 Neo, or it's very, very close to supporting it, it really struggles with tilting the monitor up. Now, as long as you tighten everything you possibly can on this, but it does still have an issue because the center of gravity isn't the same as on the 49-inch models, because this has all of that extra weight that's pulling the screen down on the front of it on the 57-inch model. It just really, really struggles. Like, even though it's technically capable, I've also seen a Reddit post from somebody who has taken apart the stand that comes with this monitor, removed the pivot head, and then mounted that onto the Visa mount, which sounds like a pretty good solution until someone can come out with like a proper stand that can properly support the weight. I'm not gonna take my stand apart though. For now, I'm just gonna kind of leave it as it is. Now, Ergotron tells me that they are developing one, but honestly, I'm not sure how long it's gonna take before we actually physically see that. But again, for me, at least with the Ergotron, the arm works as long as I don't want to tilt the screen up. Like, it kind of hangs in the perfect position for me. And because I have a standing desk here, I can just, worst case, raise the desk up higher if I need to. Next question, what is the height difference between the 49-inch and the 57-inch? This is on their website as well, 429.5 millimeters on the 57-inch and 365 millimeters on the 49-inch. Now, the next question is about how hot this monitor gets. Now, this one tends to get to around about 30 degrees, so it's not too hot, but it definitely does help keep your room warm when, when it's winter and cold and those kind of things. And next up, does it have the contrast enhancer feature in the settings? Yes, it does. Does it support eARC? Now, unfortunately not. I believe eARC is only supported with screens running the Tizen OS, which the G9 OLED runs and kind of turns the monitor into more of a TV than a monitor. Now, I did try connecting it in my soundbar just to see what happens, but unfortunately, that doesn't work with this screen. Next, how does it handle scaling issues with a Mac? Now, with the M2, not a single issue whatsoever. It's been plug and play and it's basically worked brilliantly, no issues. Now with the M1, I did have to go with a dual connection, one HDMI and one DisplayPort. I didn't have any scaling issues though, but other than having a line down the middle of the screen, there was no issues. The next question was asking whether G-Sync was available on here. Now again, I don't have an NVIDIA card here, but I have been told by a friend who has that 4080 card that G-Sync is available and works. The next one was a very interesting question around gaming between various different models of the G9 screens. And the answer to this one is it depends. Like, going from the G9 OLED to the 49-inch G9 Neo, I actually prefer the OLED just because, of course, you get the better colors, it's more modern interface. But from the G9 OLED to the 57-inch G9 Neo, that's a tough choice. Now, personally, I would take the larger screen over losing the OLED. I just love the additional vertical resolution, which gives you way more screen real estate for multitasking multitasking than you do on the 49-inch version. Now, I don't think you do this much in Windows because most people just, maximize their windows to fill up a few areas of their screen. But on Mac, window management is much more fluid, I guess if you call it that. And with an ultra-wide, you can comfortably have like 10 to 15 apps open on your screen at one time, which I know it looks mad, it sounds mad, but it is so much easier to glance over at your to-do app to see what's next, or look at your calendar to know when your next call is. And some people will go like 10 apps, that's just ludicrous to have 10 things on your screen at one time. But once you take into account your browser, calendar, tasks, notes, messaging, Discord, music, Notion, email, all those kind of things. Once you realize that that can all be comfortably on screen without feeling overwhelmed, I would take that over having to repeatedly like tab between multiple apps to find the one I want. But again, I think that's more of a fundamental way that Windows management works on Macs over Windows. Next, does the M1 iPad Pro display at full resolution through Stage Manager? Coincidentally, I have an M1 iPad Pro, so I can test this. Not at full resolution, like no matter what I try, it just gives me 5120 by 1440p at 60 Hertz. Now it does also enable HDR and adaptive sync, but yeah, you don't get the maximum resolution out of this with an iPad. I tried all the settings, I just can't find a way to give you more space. So this next one was around my workaround to get the full resolution on an M1 Mac Studio, where you hook up the two cables and then use picture-by-picture mode and then having them on either side. But when placing windows in the center of the screen, you would see this like faint line where kind of maybe it was a color difference or maybe a difference in 120 Hertz on one side and 60 on the other. So he's asking whether setting both screens to 60 Hertz would fix this. Again, I tried it and the answer is unfortunately no. Even with them both set to 60, you can still see a line down the middle, even though both screens are on the same frames per second or same refresh rate and the same color profile as well. Next up, can you show console gaming set to 16:9? Does it fill the entire monitor with black bars? Now for both the PS5 and the Xbox, your choices are to basically go with the black bars if you want kind of a normal image, or you can stretch the image to fill it, which honestly just looks awful. So black bars it is for me anyway. Is the power supply noisy, and what's the distance between the wall with the VESA arm pushed all the way back? Now I've not heard any noise coming from the screen whatsoever. The only noises I hear is the click when it switches on or switches input. That's it. And in terms of the space, there is just over 2 inches between the arm and the wall behind me as well. Now that is all of the questions. What about all of the problems I've had with the screen? And genuinely, there are only 2 actual problems, and then a bit of a wish list of what I'd like to see next in the next generation of the screen. So the 2 issues are the fact the monitor arm can't truly support the weight. I mean, of course you've got the stand that comes with it. That kind of fixes the problem, unless you want to butcher that stand and then put it onto a monitor arm. But like I said, that's thankfully not a huge problem for me because it just kind of, so I've got a monitor above me now, it just kind of sags in the right place. Yes, that's what she said. But the main issue I have is when using a Mac and when my Mac goes to sleep. And it basically breaks the Mac Studio. Like often it won't wake the Mac up at all. So I have to disconnect and then reconnect the HDMI cable. And then sometimes that also messes with the resolution and it drops it down a few notches, which can only be resolved by restarting the entire Mac. And the only workaround I've got here is to basically never let the screen go to sleep and never let the Mac go to sleep. But still, it is an annoying bug. I wish it would be fixed in the future. And also for a premium price screen, there are that and also a long list of should-haves, which I hope we will see in the future generations. We've got USB-C connectivity, being able to picture-by-picture with both sides at 120 or 240 Hertz with VRR, with HDR, and also an OLED version of this size screen would be an absolute dream. I mean, I hope that is coming next year, 2024 rather. That would be incredible. And whilst I don't like the Tizen interface because it seems to be quite slow on the devices I've had it on, I'd rather be able to upgrade the firmware over the air rather than going through the faff of downloading it to USB and manually upgrading. So I hope that helps answer all of your questions. Now, please subscribe to the channel, of course, if you found that helpful. Comment down below with any more questions if you have more, and I'll do my very best to answer each and every single one of them. And I'll see you in the next video. Thank you, bye-bye.